Hello, everyone. Welcome to our quantitative history webinar. I'm Chicheng Ma from the Business School of the University of Hong Kong. I'm the moderator of today's webinar. Today, we have much pleasure to invite Professor Jed Kaplan from Department of Earth Sciences in the University of Hong Kong to give us a very fascinating topic about how did the environment shape human history. So Professor Kaplan has been our discussant for twice in our previous history webinar. So Professor Kaplan will give 1 hour presentation followed by about 10 to 15 minutes discussion. So today we are very honored to invite Professor Yanan Ding Yannan from Fudan Center of Historical Geography. So after that, we will turn to the Q&A. Well, please, Professor Kaplan.
Thank you very much, Chicheng, and thank you to the whole quantitative history seminar team, and especially Professor Chen for the invitation to come and talk with you today. I'm really pleased to be I've been really pleased to participate in this seminar series over the past year, and I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to present to you today. So I'm going to, without further ado, get my presentation up on the screen here. Let's see, just bring it up. You probably can see my screen now, and I'm going to swap that. And I'm going to put that over there. Okay. So I hope everybody can see the image now. It's okay.
Yes.
Great. And I'll go ahead and get started then. So thanks again, everyone, for joining in. It's great to see, as usual, such a wonderful, large and diverse audience here today. It's really always a very fascinating group of people that we have that join our series. Today, I'm going to talk about some of my research that I've been involved in for the last 10 years plus on the role of environment in shaping humanity and the development, I would say, of societies over the last several millennia, and in turn, how humans influenced their local, regional, and global environment. And we're going to touch a little bit on this topic of the Anthropocene and what that means towards the end of the presentation. So before I jump into it, I just do need to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm going to show here today is the result of longstanding collaborations that I've had with my students, with other members of my research group, and with collaborators around the world. And of course, I'd like to thank various agencies that have supported my research over the last decades, and universities and institutions where I have been working. I realize that a lot of people in the audience here today are probably not environmental scientists, at least not in the sense that I might, or some colleagues of mine might imagine that. So I'd like to just first of all, give you a very brief overview or introduction to the role of land cover in the Earth system and how and why land cover is important for climate. Okay, land cover by itself is a product of climate. It's a product of soil conditions, and it's a product of topography and a few other factors. And those different external drivers, if you want, influence what the landscape looks like. If it's covered by forest, if it's a desert, grassland, an ice sheet or a glacier, all of these things, even a lake, all of these things represent different forms of land cover. And that land cover can change over time as climate changes. It can change over time as soils develop or as soils are eroded away. And it can change over time as a result of human activities. Land cover changes brought on by people to use that land for their own purposes. If that would happen to be agriculture, or if that would happen to be pastoralism or hunting and gathering, all of those human activities can lead to changes in the landscape. And those changes in the landscape can feed back to the atmosphere and in turn influence climate. In particular, when we think about feedbacks between land cover and atmosphere, we think about two primary sort of pathways that land cover influences the atmosphere and influences climate. And one of those is our biogeochemical feedbacks. Those are changes in the concentration of greenhouse gases and dust and other aerosols in the atmosphere that are brought on by land cover change. So if forests die back for one reason or another, then there's transfer of carbon that was in that living biomass into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. If we have wetlands on the landscape and they grow, then and those wetlands emit methane, then that methane can be released to the atmosphere. So we have other trace gases and aerosols that change the chemical composition of the atmosphere that influence the amount of heat that is either absorbed or reflected by the atmosphere back into space or towards the Earth's surface, and therefore global temperature. So something that I think many of you are probably aware of in the contemporary context, but it's important to keep in mind that these biogeochemical feedbacks also occur naturally, and they occur naturally over long periods of time. There also is a second pathway called biogeophysical feedbacks, and that is actually the physical properties of the Earth's surface, how bright that surface is. Is it a dark surface that absorbs lots of solar radiation, like a parking lot? Or is it a bright surface, like a snowfield, that reflects most of the solar radiation that it receives back into space? Okay. So those physical properties of the Earth's surface affect climate, and those physical properties of the Earth's surface can obviously be changed by people. And so changes in the Earth's surface, be they caused by humans or by other natural processes, can influence climate, which can in turn itself feed back to those terrestrial processes. So that's just the sort of 2-minute sciencey version of backgrounds that I think you need to keep in mind when you're listening to the rest of this talk. So we're very interested, at least I've been very interested, in how humans influence the global environment and climate. And in that sense, it's interesting to think about when did that process of humans influencing global climate actually start? When did humans actually start to have an influence on the environment? And in order to appreciate that, I think we need to go back to the world before us, if you want. 200,000 years ago, we were in the penultimate interglacial. This is a warm period between ice ages. Right now, we live in a warm period between ice ages. About 15,000 years ago, there was the end of the last ice age, which lasted itself about 100,000 years. Then there was a short warm period. Then there was another ice age. And before that, 200,000 years ago, was the second to last warm period in Earth's history. And during this warm period in Earth's history, we saw the emergence of modern humans in southern and eastern Africa. So if we want to really imagine what the world was like before us, we've got to go pretty far back in time. Particularly if you're a historian, you might maybe not always think about events that occurred 200,000 years ago. Even 200,000 years ago, when modern humans were evolving in Africa, there were other hominid species present on the planet, Homo erectus and Neanderthals. And you can see in the Denisova hominin, which we know relatively little about, but we know that it existed somewhere in Asia. Okay. Let's see what happens then over time. Well, Homo erectus, as I mentioned, lived in Africa and right across into Eastern Asia. And they might have had some influence on the landscape. You can see that these Homo erectus have some stone tools in this photo, and it's actually a small campfire burning there on the edge in this artist's impression. Okay, but they were relatively small in number. We don't expect there to have actually been very large populations of Homo erectus, and therefore we don't really expect them to have had a huge influence on climate. 150,000 years ago, during the penultimate glacial maximum, so this was the period of maximum glaciation that followed that warm period, we start to see the expansion of modern humans throughout Africa and probably even in a series of advances into Asia. Although these early out migrations of humans from Africa to Asia are less well understood than what came later in history. Into the last interglacial, there were not a lot of changes in the distribution of hominins on this map. For sure, by this time, humans were present everywhere in Africa. They might have been out of Africa in one or more waves of people making it into South Asia, but there were still relatively small populations of humans and other hominins on the planet. It isn't really until we get into the last glacial cycle, the last ice age cycle, which starts about 105,000 years ago, that we start to see bigger changes in the distribution of people on the planet. 90,000 years ago, in the early part of the last glacial, for sure, humans are present everywhere in Africa, and they've started moving into Asia. And there's something interesting happens during the last glaciation. One of the things that we understand very well now from paleoclimate reconstructions is that the climate of the last glacial cycle was extremely variable. What you can see here is there's a lot in this plot, but what you can focus on perhaps is this black line, which represents temperature at the summit of Greenland, which is not really a perfect analog for global. It's not at all a perfect analog for what global temperature was like, but it does give you a relative idea of what the climate of the last glaciation was like in writ large, if you want, okay? And what we see is that starting around 60,000 years ago, at the beginning of this period that's marked in gray called marine isotope stage 3, we see these extremely rapid and high amplitude shifts in climate at Greenland, almost as big as the shift that we see at the end of the last ice age from cold conditions up to the warm conditions of the Holocene, of the period that we live in now. This period of abrupt climate change is the period that marks the rapid expansion of humans, the final rapid expansion of humans out of Africa and into Eurasia. And it marks at the same time the demise of all of the other hominin species, so that by 21,000 years ago, period that we call the last glacial maximum, the period when we had the largest coverage of ice sheets in the world during the last glacial cycle, modern humans are present pretty much everywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere, with the exception of a few large islands like Madagascar and New Zealand, and probably the northern and easternmost reaches of Siberia. At this time as well, all of the other hominin species, Homo erectus and Denisova and Neanderthal, they've all gone extinct. So something happened during that 60,000 year period, during the last ice age, where humans became well adapted to this abrupt climate change and to a variety of different environments in a way that allowed them to outcompete other hominins. And it's perhaps at this point, at the last glacial maximum, that we can start to imagine large-scale human impact on the environment. So the last glacial maximum itself was this period marked by this red line here at 21,000 years ago. And it is a period of relatively stable and cold, but not the coldest conditions towards the end of the last glacial cycle. And it's been a focus of research for understanding the Earth's climate at a time when its conditions were very different from today. So climate modelers, atmospheric scientists have studied the last glacial maximum for decades and tried to understand what the Earth's climate was like at that time. One of the things that drives me or motivates me is not just trying to understand what the Earth's climate was like at that time, but trying to understand what role humans might have played in influencing Earth's climate at that time. And the last bullet point on this slide drives home that point that we have very little understanding of how much of a role humans played in influencing the large-scale environment in recent Earth's history. when humans change land cover through their land use, the way that they change their land cover is a product not only of the environmental conditions that exist at a particular time, but also about the livelihood that people had at that time. If people subsisted off of small scale agriculture or pastoralism, they will influence the landscape in a very, very different way than if they have intensive agriculture based on cultivating rice and rice paddies, for example. And so major developments in human history, as I wrote there, changed the way people interacted with and influenced and modified the environment. So let's go back to the last glacial maximum for a moment. When people think of the last glacial maximum, they often think of these kind of typical barren landscapes like this picture, which is actually a picture of nowadays taken in Alaska, but it kind of gives you an idea of what many people think, at least large parts of the Northern Hemisphere looked like outside of the tropics during the last glacial maximum, sort of empty treeless plains. But of course, these treeless landscapes were not empty. They were filled with what we call megafauna, giant animals, like these woolly mammoths. There's horses in that picture. There's some large cats that are eating elk. Okay, so they're all different kinds of Pleistocene megafauna, many of which are now extinct, which lived on that last glacial maximum landscape. Now I want to take you to the first sort of conundrum, if you want, of that's motivated a lot of my research over the last few years. And this is what I call the forested Europe conundrum of the last glacial maximum. We know a lot about what the last glacial maximum was like because I mentioned it's been a focus of research for environmental historians and earth system scientists. And one of the ways that we understand what the landscape was like was by using pollen data. Pollen that is recovered, so tiny grains of pollen that are recovered from sediments that were taken from lakes and bogs and other sedimentary archives and dated to different periods in time, including the last glacial maximum. By using this pollen data, one of the things that we can see, and here we have a map of Europe. So this is the Atlantic on the left-hand side during the last glacial maximum. The Atlantic on the left-hand side, the Fennoscandian and British Irish ice sheets in dark blue at the north. This is the Alps, the Alpine ice sheet in the middle, and the Pyrenees. And you can basically make out the outline of the Mediterranean and the other major water bodies. You may notice some differences here. That's because sea level was about 100 meters lower during the last glacial maximum than it is at present, because so much water was locked up in these giant ice sheets. So that's why the coastlines maybe look a little bit different. But what we can also see here is that pollen data analysis suggests that most of Europe during the last glacial maximum was covered by some kind of grassland, okay? But whenever we would use models that use climate and soils data to simulate the land cover of the last glacial maximum, we'd end up with maps that look like this. And in a map like this, what you see is a lot of Europe, particularly outside of the Mediterranean, has a substantial forest cover, 50 to 80% forest cover over large parts of Europe. And this is a problem, this is a conundrum, because how could we reconcile this kind of map, which suggests there's a lot of grassland, with this kind of map, which suggests that there should have been a lot of forest? One of the ideas I had several years ago now was that perhaps it's because the models that were being used to generate this kind of land cover map are missing a key process. And that key process that they were missing was human activity. And so the first land use revolution, if you want, the first major way that humans used land and altered landscapes was through their use of fire. This is a bit of an over-dramatized painting of Pleistocene hunter-gatherers hunting horses at a cliff in France. Is actually a real place It's actually now known that that they probably didn't chase the horses off the cliff, but they drove them up to the base of the cliff in order to kill them. But what interested me here was what those hunters are doing. They have got a fire going on here in the background. Pleistocene hunter-gatherers knew very well how to use fire as a tool to help their hunting and to maintain landscapes in a way that made it easier for them to move around and to not get killed by big animals, by giant cats, or by mammoths, or by other hazards, okay? And also to improve their gathering opportunities. We also know that hunter-gatherers are present throughout Europe at the last glacial maximum. We have archaeological databases like this. We can take those archaeological sites that date to the last glacial maximum. You can actually make a kind of heat map if you want, that sort of says where are the concentration of people. And we actually know quite well that there were concentrations of people there in the southwest of France, for example, where we find some of the most famous cave art that dates to the last glacial maximum. So on the basis of this information, I was able to put together a model that estimates the carrying capacity of a landscape for hunter-gatherers at any time, but in this case for the last glacial maximum. And that model has two simple functions. One is a logistic function that determines habitability as a function of the primary productivity of the landscape. And it basically says that once you move below a certain threshold, when the landscape productivity is too low, then it's not really suitable for people to live in that landscape. So when you sort of in this kind of ice tundra environment, then it starts to be too unproductive to be able to support many people. The other thing which we can show, or which we can assume in this model, is that people also prefer to live in heterogeneous, semi-open environments. Environments which are not fully dense forest, and environments that are not fully open, like deserts. Of course, people can live in deserts and people can live in dense forest, but there's a preference for hunter-gatherers, and there's lots of ethnographic observations to support this. There's a preference for hunter-gatherers to live in heterogeneous environments that have a combination of denser patches of vegetation with more open ones. This allows them to move around, to see things, but then also to have shelter on those bad weather conditions, for example. So taking these two functions together, a productivity function and a tree cover function, we are able to simulate the population density of Europe at the last glacial maximum. And what we can show without using any archaeological data as a driver is that indeed those areas like the southwest of France, where we simulate the highest population density, are also the places where we have the most documented archaeological sites dating to this time. So this gave us a little bit of confidence that perhaps we're doing something right. Okay. So we could take this map of population density and we could put that into a computer simulation, a model of human-induced wildfire and how that influenced land cover. And so here we have just a very simple schematic of this fire model where we have fuel characteristics, we have fire behavior, we have human ignition, so they're able to start fires, and all of that influences the landscape through, say, trees or vegetation killed, and influences the land cover. We assumed in this modeling study that hunter-gatherers preferred to live, as I mentioned, in semi-open landscapes. So that's interesting here because what we can actually simulate is a feedback between humans and their environment. Humans move into a landscape, and if it's too closed for their liking, they'll try to light it on fire and burn some of it and open it up to get to that kind of sweet spot of about 50% openness. Now, if it's a tropical rainforest, it rains all the time, it's impossible to get any fire going. Then after a little while, then the people just give up and they move on. They'll try to live in a different place. And likewise, if it's a desert, there's nothing to burn, then humans can't cause any additional fire. But there are plenty of places on the landscape where humans can actually manage it to be the way they want. And we can actually show by doing model experiments where we include human burning and contrast those with model experiments without humans, that human-induced fire could increase the amount of fire on the landscape by not a lot, but let's say 4 to 8%, 4 to 9% in large parts of Europe, or 2 to 8%. So what does this actually mean for the vegetation cover? Well, here we can look at the forest cover that I showed you a moment ago, where I said this is not consistent with independent observations, where there's a lot of forests in Europe. But if we put people into that landscape and allow them to burn it, then the landscape opens up and we have a much more open landscape, which is more consistent with what we observe in paleo environmental records and pollen records, for example. So humans, hunter-gatherers living in the late Pleistocene, using fire, perhaps opened up landscapes on a very large scale. And we have some independent evidence to suggest from other or new analysis of pollen data that this was potentially reasonable. And so, as I mentioned, these climate simulations show large differences between models, but much of Europe may have been suitable for human occupation. And so human application of fire, even in a limited way, against vegetation, forests that would have been stressed by the cold temperatures and low carbon dioxide concentrations of the last glacial maximum, could have led to a large-scale opening of landscapes. And this allows us to come up with a scenario with a result that reconciles models and independent observations or independent reconstructions of land cover. So now we can scale this up and we can think about could this have meant not just at the scale of Europe, but what could this have meant at the scale of the entire world? Now, at the last glacial maximum, humans were not present in the Western Hemisphere. Their progress into the Americas was blocked by the presence of this absolutely massive ice sheet, or series of massive ice sheets that were over what's effectively Canada today, and parts of the northern United States. But humans were pretty much everywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere, with the exception, as I mentioned earlier, of these large islands. So when we put humans on the map here, and we allow them to burn the landscape, what we see is that there is large scale, there's a large range of areas, environments, and habitats that people could have lived in where a judicious application of fire would have made it easier for them to survive. And particularly we see that across Eurasia, but we also see that in the seasonally arid parts of Africa. So not in the really rainforest areas, neither in Africa nor in Indonesia, but in the Sudanian Sahel region nowadays that we call of Africa, and also in India, and also in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So this increase in fire over the natural background levels caused by people would have led to changes in forest cover. And so here what we see is forest cover in the last glacial maximum in the absence of humans. And when we put humans into the map, onto the map or into the model, we see this opening of the landscape. Now it's not everywhere. And if you, of course, in the Western Hemisphere here, nothing's happening because there's no people there, okay? But if you look at the differences, what you especially see is that sort of across Eurasia in the sort of colder and drier parts, there's a large scale reduction in forest cover caused by people. There's also some more moderate reduction in forest cover in places like China, India, and in Northern Africa, and right down into Australia. Okay, so people could have had large-scale influence on land cover in the late glacial time. And this large-scale influence on land cover, or reduction in tree cover, would have been important enough to have a biogeophysical feedback to climate that could have intensified already cold glacial conditions. So one could suggest that already during the last glacial period, towards the end of the last glacial cycle, during the depths of the last glaciation, what we call the last glacial maximum, humans may have had the first large-scale transformation of the Earth system. Now, let's go a little bit further ahead in history to the beginning of the Holocene. So we went from 21,000 years ago, we've fast forwarded 10,000 years to 11,000 years ago. And by this time, humans are not only present all over the Eastern Hemisphere and probably right up into the Arctic, but they also moved into the Western Hemisphere and clear down to the southern tip of South America. There's still a few small islands where we don't see human populations, but this is really the period where we can start to think about humans having a large-scale influence on the global environment, in particular on the biogeochemical feedbacks, on changes in the chemical composition of the atmosphere. And this brings me to another enigma, if you want. We've gone from a conundrum to an enigma, the enigma of Holocene carbon dioxide and methane concentrations. And that is that when we look at ice core records of previous interglacial periods, what we typically see is something that looks like what we saw at the beginning of our current interglacial, where CO2 rises to a certain peak and then starts to gradually decline. And methane does a very similar thing. It rises to a peak and then gradually decline. And we noticed that at the first part of the Holocene, this seems to also be happening in the most recent period in Earth history. But then there is this departure from the natural trend around 8,000 years ago for CO2 and around 6,000 years ago for methane. And a question which has driven a huge amount of scientific research over the last 2 decades or so is, what was the link between humans and this departure from the natural trend in these greenhouse gases? And certainly this is the period, this is the only period in Earth history when there were enough people and they were distributed on enough of the Earth that we could start to imagine that human activity could have an influence on greenhouse gas concentrations. So it's worth them thinking about what happened over this period from 8,500 BC up to 1850. Well, of course, we went from hunting and gathering to agriculture and pastoralism. And that is by far the most important major change in society that occurs in the pre-industrial period before the Industrial Revolution. Agriculture starts independently in a lot of different parts of the world. The idea of agriculture then spreads to other parts of the world so that by the mid-Holocene, we see agriculture emerging on nearly all continents, basically all continents except for Australia where we don't really have true agriculture. But it does emerge certainly in East Asia. These are just the names of the different crops that were domesticated and where they were domesticated. So we have the typical cereals and some legumes that come from what we call the Fertile Crescent here in the Levant and Southwest Asia. Of course, we have rice, which is domesticated in the lower and middle Yangtze. We also have millets, which come from North China. Other varieties of rice domesticated in India. Tubers domesticated in Africa and in New Guinea, and other types of millet cereals and so on. once agriculture starts, it also spreads fairly rapidly. And we know now from quite a lot of archaeological research that's been done during the last few decades that already by 3,800 years ago, in what we call the Bronze Age, there was a cross-continental exchange of cereal crops throughout Eurasia and Africa. So wheat and barley, which come from Southwest Asia here, make it all the way into Western Europe, but they also make it all the way into China. Millets and sorghum make it from this Sudanian area in Africa across into India. Asian millets and buckwheat make it from Asia into Europe and into South Asia, from East Asia into Europe and South Asia, and so on. So the idea of agriculture spreads rapidly. The other thing, of course, that changes over the pre-industrial period is something that revolutionizes our relationship with the landscape, and that is the development of metallurgy. First copper, then bronze and iron. These are a few different bronze tools which have been recovered from archaeological sites in Europe. So we had a saw, an axe, a sickle, this is a hoe. These implements not only change the way people can use their landscape, but they also change the demands that humans have for primary energy. If you want to mine and if you want to smelt metals, you need much more fuel. And that fuel comes chiefly from wood in the pre-industrial period. And so demand for metal fuels demand for forest, which leads to deforestation. And some of that forest never goes back to being forest again. Once it's been cleared, it is used for other purposes like pasture or farmland. So we had fire, we had agriculture, we had metallurgy, and the fourth major land use transition of the pre-industrial world is trade. Large-scale trade in bulk commodities starts in the empires of antiquity, and this was already a form, as I wrote, of delocalization of economic activity. Grain, cereals are being grown in Egypt to feed Rome. Olive oil is being imported in massive quantities from Spain to other parts of the Roman Empire. And so this is just an example. This is a landfill, if you want, an artificial mountain, a hill outside Rome called the Monte Testaccio. It's about 40 meters high or so, which is basically built up on the first one-way use packaging, if you want, 53 million amphorae that were used to transport olive oil from Spain to Rome during the peak of the Roman Empire. Similarly, we have the construction of the Grand Canal and huge development of long-distance trade in commodities in East Asia. So what did this mean for the environment? Well, human activities like the ones I described all lead to the emissions of greenhouse gases. The development of pottery produces a demand for primary energy. The domestication of ruminant animals leads to, first of all, demand for pasture land, but also emissions of methane. I talked about metallurgy, wet rice cultivation, which also starts to become important around 6,000 years ago, leads to deforestation and to methane emissions. We have a revolution in our agricultural techniques, or well, I don't know if I would actually posit it as a revolution, as rather a continuous development of agricultural techniques over time that allow land to support more and more people. And of course, all of this ultimately leads to the development of complex societies. So come back to quantitative history. One of the things that I have been trying to do over the last many years is to try to understand how these activities, to quantify precisely what these activities mean in terms of impact on climate and environment. And one of the ways that we've done that is by trying to come up with a model of land use that is a function of population. And we could say that at higher population densities, there will be a greater demand for land and so on. And it looks like this logistic, this is just a very simple empirical model based on this logistic function that gives you an idea at any given population density, how much land you'd actually need to support those people. We can also distribute that land use in space as a function of climate and soil. So here are just a couple of example maps for Europe showing suitability for cultivation, where you have low suitability for cultivation in the north or in the deserts where it's dry or too cold, or in the high mountains. Okay, high suitability for cultivation in other regions where especially you have good soils and good climate. And similarly, we can make kind of maps like that for pasture, and we can, putting that together with estimates of past population, simulate things like land cover change over time. And so here you have just maps of Europe. The greener colors are areas with less human impact. The redder colors are areas with more human impact. And this goes through from 1000 BC, so sort of beginning of the Iron Age, right through to the late pre-industrial. We can also do this at global scale. And here we have two different maps that show different interpretations of what the world might have been like about 4000 at 4000 BC, sort of in the middle Holocene. One suggesting that the bottom one, which is the scenario that I have made, suggesting that already 6,000 years ago, for example, in the North China Plain, there might have been significant impact of humans on landscape, whereas this other scenario basically says there's no human impact at all on landscapes at that time. So now, returning to the way in which this land use affects climate, I want to give you a few examples of work that we have done to try to quantify these biogeochemical and biogeophysical feedbacks. We've done a series of different types of studies. We've done regional studies where we focused mainly on the biogeophysical feedbacks. How did changing from forest into grassland or pasture or cropland affect climate locally? Those used global climate models or regional climate models. I apologize for not spelling out the acronyms here. And they tend to be studied in idealized time periods. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. We've also done a series of global studies, which I will describe at the end. In these different scenarios, what we can show is there is a real biogeophysical feedback from human land use on climate conditions. And we just focus on this right-hand column here. What we see is that during wintertime, this is at 6,000 BP, during wintertime, there's very little influence on climate, but during summertime, deforestation makes the climate warmer in the northern and central parts of Europe, for example. And we can also show that in 1800, we have similar kinds of effect. Deforestation makes the climate warmer in summertime in the central parts of Europe, but deforestation actually makes the climate cooler in the Mediterranean. This is related to the change in albedo, to the brighter surface. When you cut down trees and you have grassland or agricultural land that is there afterwards, the surface of the earth is brighter, and so more solar radiation is reflected back to space. We can show similar things for changes in precipitation. I don't have time to go through all of these in detail, so I'm not going to. I want to have plenty of time for questions. So I will just show you a couple of other examples. Peak deforestation in classical antiquity, which also leads to climate changes. This is drier conditions over that central part of Northern Europe. It's a biogeophysical feedback, okay? And again, the peak deforestation in classical antiquity leads to changes in albedo, changes in evapotranspiration that make climate, in this case, in this particular example, it leads to cooler climates over much of Europe, mainly because of this albedo feedback, but also because of air pollution. And this is interesting. So here we have the Roman economy, which many people think, oh, it's an agrarian society, right? Okay. But it wasn't only an agrarian society, it was also an urban society. And cities and industries that took place in cities during the Roman period in Europe led to air pollution. Metallurgy was an important part of the Roman economy. And so it was not just mining, but also smelting and recycling and reworking of metals. And it was so important that we can actually see it very clearly in glacier ice. This is a plot that goes from left to right. So we have the Iron Age on the right, classical on the left, classical antiquity in the middle, and so on. And we see this big spike in the amount of lead deposited in Greenland that can be traced back to metallurgy and economic activity during the Roman Empire period. And so the skies were actually polluted already in Roman times. And that polluted atmosphere actually cooled the Earth's surface, because putting aerosols into the atmosphere, which we've shown now in various chemistry models, leads to a reflection of sunlight back into space, and therefore relatively cooler temperatures. We have shown similar results for Mesoamerica, and I won't really belabor these except to show that in pre-Columbian worlds, there was much more deforestation than there was at the early colonial period. The colonial period being marked by the collapse of the indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere and to large-scale afforestation, or let's say land abandonment. Wasn't always land going back into forest, but there was a large period of land abandonment that followed European arrival in the Americas. And this we have investigated by using climate model simulations, sort of mirroring the pre-colonial period and the colonial period. And what we've again been able to show is that during the pre-colonial period, when we had the maximum amount of deforestation, summer temperatures were hotter and summers were drier as a result of that deforestation here in Mexico and Central America. Okay. So people had an influence on the regional environment. And the next thing we want to do then is we want to really see, well, what influence do people have on the global environment? And so we started to put together population estimates from different historical demographic data sets from around the world. And here we have just an example of population estimates from Russia. There are also some excellent estimates of population in China, at least covering the last 2,000 years or so, based on demographers' analysis of primary historical material, and then of course extrapolation and inference, if you want, to try to figure out what past populations were like. And we were able to take those literature estimates, which cover roughly the last 3,000 years, with a model of potential natural population, if you want, that takes into account how and where people were using agriculture at different times, and build that into a global historical population database that covers these 207 regions of the world, some of which are amalgamations of countries, others are subdivisions of countries. So at the scale of China, for example, we have estimates of population for the last 8,000 years. They're estimates, and it's a scenario of population. I would say it's not based on truth, because we obviously don't have census data that goes back that far in time, but nevertheless, we were able to come up with some estimates for all of these different regions of the world. The other data that we have is information on cities, and I have an animation here, but I don't think it's going to work. So I'm just going to show you a few different images from this. We know something about urban populations and how they change over time. And so here you just have a few maps from a database that I put together that covers the entire Holocene. And these red circles here indicate the size and location of the 100 or so largest cities. And what you can see here is that those cities, of course, grow over time. So here we are in sort of early classical antiquity, and there was already some substantial urban area in East Asia, in the Mediterranean, and in South Asia, for example. And if we go further on, we see the first Rome, the development of the first city over 1 million people, large-scale development of cities along the Yangtze and parts of China. And of course, the story of human history is the story of generally ever increasing urbanization, the development of medieval cities in Eurasia. And we'll just kind of move through so you can see how that changes over time. Now, of course, the world we live in today is very different than the world of prehistory, as you can see here, but nevertheless, people did live in urban settlements over time. And we were able to use that data along with the model that I described to you earlier, relating population with land use to make a map of land, to make a scenario of land cover change over time. And I won't play the animation, but I'll just give you again a few selected slides. So starting at 8,000 years ago, most of the world has very little land use, but playing it forward, what you can already see is by about 2000 BC, by about 4,000 years ago, there are some very important areas of land use, particularly in Southwest Asia, also in China and in parts of the Americas. Areas that would have been very largely transformed through human activity. And playing that again, even farther forward, you just see how land use expands in its geographic distribution over time. And there aren't many times of contraction. You might notice, I just play here, if you look at the Americas, you've got South America, 1450, so before European arrival, and then 1550, about 50 years after European arrival, and by 1650, this is what I'm talking about, this large scale land abandonment that occurs because of the collapse of the indigenous populations. But eventually that comes back, and then by 1850, very large, by the sort of beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, very large parts of Earth's surface are very substantially transformed by people through agriculture and pastoralism, especially into landscapes that are intensively managed and supporting large populations. So I guess I put this slide in just to remind myself, to remind you that there are different scenarios. So the scenario that I'm showing you is only one scenario, and I'm going to show you a few results from this other scenario here, this high 3.2 scenario, just to give a bit of a contrast here. So let's return to the enigma of Holocene CO2 and methane and try to understand what happened during this 8,000 year period before the Industrial Revolution that could have caused carbon dioxide and methane concentrations to depart from what we might expect them to have done under ordinary circumstances, under circumstances that we observed in previous interglacials. We used these two different land use scenarios to drive a global carbon model that simulates the emissions of carbon through the clearance of forests and the transformation of landscapes caused by people. And what we see here is that if you use what I call the low early land use scenario, this is the Hyde scenario, over this 8,000 year period, there's the cumulative emission of about 170 petagrams or gigatons of carbon from land to the atmosphere. And most of it comes during the last 500 years or so. If you use this high early land use scenario, my scenario, what you see is that there's a continuous emissions of greenhouse gases over this entire time, with the exception of this short period following the arrival of Europeans in the Western Hemisphere, when we have this huge land abandonment episode, when actually there's a big period of carbon uptake, but nevertheless, we emitted about 350 petagrams of carbon over this period. So if we look and try to understand what that means in terms of this link between population and atmospheric CO2, what we see is that there is certainly a period when CO2 is rising slightly, this is this line with the dots on it. So all the different dots are the actual measurements of carbon dioxide in ice, in polar ice, Antarctic ice that we have. And then the black line is the kind of best fit line through that, through all the scatter there. What we see is that there's a continuous emissions of carbon dioxide caused by people to the atmosphere over this period, starting around 3,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Iron Age in Eurasia. Before that, carbon dioxide rises. It's harder to explain that in the context of human activities. So, but during this early, so just to summarize that, in this early to mid-Holocene period, I would say that there is a rise there that's driven by natural processes. But after the start of the Iron Age, human emissions start to become globally important. And there is some geochemical evidence that this might be true as well. At a period when we would expect CO2 to be falling, it's not. It's either stable or rising. When we look in more detail at just the last 1,000 years or so, we can see very clearly, in my opinion, a relationship between human history and atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. So this gray line here represents atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations measured with very high resolution in Antarctic ice. And these bars here represent important periods in human history over this time. And what we see is periods of expansion, of economic and agricultural expansion that, in my view, are not coincidentally happening at the same time that CO2 is rising. So deforestation in Europe, deforestation in East Asia are driving CO2 higher. Mongol invasions and Black Death and drought and disease are causing CO2 to drop. Another period of rising deforestation leads to rising CO2, and then this big drop in CO2 being caused by the collapse of the indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere. So I'm almost done. I want to come back now to this anthropogenic CO2 and anthropogenic methane and anthropogenic land cover change, and try to understand what this implies for global climate. And in order to do that, what we did is we did different scenarios with computer simulation models, where we ran a model with the Earth we had in 1850, and we contrasted that with the Earth that we might have had if people hadn't been present on the planet, with lower carbon dioxide concentrations, with lower methane concentrations, and without any deforestation. And so let's first look at the biogeophysical feedback. These are chiefly changes in the brightness or the reflectivity of the Earth's surface caused by a change from forest to grassland or agricultural land, but also changes in evapotranspiration. It's a change in the amount of water which is transpired. So crops transpire less water than forests. And so what we generally see here is that if you isolate only those biogeophysical effects, we have a brighter surface over much of the northern hemisphere, leading to cooler temperatures. It's not a huge change. In fact, on the global mean, there's a net cooling of just about 0.17 degrees Celsius. You do see some interesting areas where it actually gets warmer, particularly here in the Sahel and here in India. These are places where the evapotranspiration effect is more important than the brightness effect or the albedo effect. In contrast, if we think about the planet that we had in 1850 versus one we might have had without human action, without this rise in atmospheric CO2 and methane concentrations, we see a large-scale warming caused by this higher than expected greenhouse gases. And that warming is particularly important at the highest latitudes, which is also what we see in the present day, and going into, and what we project for the future, that the Arctic and Antarctic will warm faster than the rest of the world. But it's still a global effect. So we can take this biogeochemical effect and we can merge it together with the biogeophysical effect. and we have the total change in global climate that might have occurred as a result of human activities, at least in part, over the Holocene. And that is a warmer world of about 3/4 of a degree with lots of geographic variability, okay? In places where there was a lot of land cover change, where there's a lot of deforestation, for example, if you look at China, much of South China, if you look at parts of Europe or East North America, the changes are actually neutral because this increase in albedo, so more sunlight being reflected back to space, is offsetting the warmer temperatures that would be caused by rising greenhouse gases. In other parts of the world, we have this combined effect. So in India or in the Sahel, we have actually warmer temperatures caused both by biogeochemical and biogeophysical feedbacks. So I'm out of time and just want to conclude now by hoping that I was able to convince you that humans have had a very big influence on the global environment, on regional and possibly even global, since the last ice age. And during the most recent period in Earth's history, the Holocene, human activities were so pervasive that they changed regional and global climate. So what does this mean? I said I would mention the Anthropocene. What does this mean? As a political concept, I think the Anthropocene is useful because it acknowledges the role that humans play in the Earth system. We are as important a force nowadays in influencing Earth's climate as changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun, or changes in the configurations of the continents through continental drift. But when did that really start and how did that manifest itself? It manifests itself in different places and at different times, and we need to go pretty far back, definitely into the last ice age, to really understand when and how human influence was becoming an important part of the global environmental system. Okay, well, thank you so much for your attention. I hope I raised some questions. I hope you were interested. I hope I shared the correct screen. After all this time, I'm a little bit worried about which screen I was sharing. Oh my gosh, nobody told me that I was sharing the wrong screen. I'm very, very sorry about that.
Okay, thank you, Jed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jed. Perfect. So now let's invite Professor Yan and Ding from Fudan University Center for Historical Geography to give a more than 10 minutes discussion. Professor Ding.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Zhichen, and thank you, Jed. I was really illuminated to have heard Jed's very informative and very interesting talk on this topic, and I've learned very much from it. I will try to keep my comments very brief because I believe there will be a lot of questions directed on Jed. So briefly, let me begin by saying that Jed has shown the robustness of modeling these quantitative methods in the study of global climate change, especially factoring in the human influence, because as the common sense of everybody here in this online meeting, we can feel the impact of human activities, but it's very difficult to quantify it, let alone to demonstrate it at a global scale. But with all this analysis, with all this modeling and visualization, Jed has shown with his and also the works of his colleagues how human activities have changed the climate over the last 8,000 years. I have a few, it's more like a comment than a question to Jed. First, when you were trying to show us the modeling of land use changes as a result of the during the time of LGM in Europe, you said you applied some ethnographic work to determine the preference of the human beings when they were trying to settle, to find a place of find their habitat. And because perhaps it's due to the time limit, you didn't elaborate very much on these ethnographic methods. Was that some kind of interviews with people living, leading different ways of lives, like agricultural workers or farmers, etc.? I hope you will be able to clarify a little bit on that.
Sure.
And also the 4 factors that you've singled out on the as the main human impact on the climate. The 4th is trade. Well, I'm sure that the trade was a very important factor in all the human activities, especially considering the long distance trade that has brought some vital materials from one place to another, and metal products are one of them. And also, as you said, the foodstuff, and also the wine, olive oil, etc., etc. Still, I'm a little bit skeptical, because in pre-industrial age, the trade conducted mostly on a regional scale. So of course we know that after the age of discovery, the trade are being conducted globally. But each year there may be a handful, or maybe 20 or 30 ships going out to trade globally. But I believe the scale or the impact are mostly directed locally instead of globally. So how important is the influence of trade on the climate? I would really love to know more about that. And
okay.
Also, I'm grateful that you've raised the issue of the trans-regional impact, as you gave in the. As you demonstrate in the example of the deposit of lead in Greenland as a result of the deforestation in Europe. I think that's really a very good reminder to all of us about this let's say trans-regional impact on climate, because normally we would tend to think the impact are local. And last but not least, I think when you raised the question of the let's say the suitability of the term Anthropocene, and as I understand it, if I understood it correctly, you would prefer to use the term quaternary. I can only say that I agree with you. That's all for me.
Great questions. Thank you so much, Professor Ding. Those were some very thought-provoking. So I made a few notes. Yeah, let's first talk about how did we figure out what kind of habitats did Pleistocene hunter-gatherers like to live in. I am not an ethnographer, and neither am I an archaeologist. Fortunately, this has been a very interesting topic of research for quite a long time, in particular by archaeologists and paleoanthropologists. And while we did not do any of the ethnographic work ourselves, we based our model on observations, on direct observations from other researchers. And in particular, there's a archaeologist, the late Lewis Binford, who is quite famous in this field, who has really spent a large part of his career studying hunter-gatherer societies and trying to understand the relationship between their population size and their mobility patterns and the environment. And Binford was one of the anthropologists that suggested that humans would prefer living in these semi-open environments as opposed to closed, dense closed forests, or say completely open grasslands or deserts. And he bases that on the fact, well, he bases that in part on empirical observation. So he says, okay, the people who live in the heterogeneous environments are more numerous and have higher densities. But also he bases it on the idea that there are just more different things to eat and more opportunities to take shelter and be protected from bad weather or from predators and these kind of things if you live in this heterogeneous environment. So there's long literature on this topic, and fortunately we're able to sort of tap into that in order to develop a really simple sort of empirical model that we could use for these simulations. It's much harder to do that for the period following, when agriculture becomes important. Then it's much more difficult to simply say, all right, people will have a better livelihood or more successful survival strategy under X environmental conditions than under Y. Once people have agriculture and domesticated animals and various other, and even tools, metallurgy, and finally trade, then you cannot simply use environmental variables to predict where they will be on the landscape and how many there will be. So much depends on culture, on technology, on other socioeconomic factors that determine the land use pattern. Your second comment was about trade and how important trade was in the pre-industrial or pre-modern world. I agree with you that large-scale trade in bulk commodities was very limited and did not happen over large areas of the planet. Nevertheless, it is important in certain places and times in history. And when we think about doing quantitative history and we think about trying to actually assign numbers to, say, land use area or to map it out, if you simply assumes that the city of Rome sustained itself through the cultivation of the hinterland around Rome, you would quickly realize it's impossible to sustain a population of that size on the basis of just the suitable agricultural land, which was nearby. And so on the one hand, yes, it's limited, but on the other hand, there are periods and there are places in history, and places on Earth when it's essential to take into account the fact that there was long distance trade in commodities that were supplying certain cities and certain parts of the landscape, and that led to land use impacts that were really distal from the local population. So, another good example, economic historian Jason Moore has written a lot about deforestation in early modern Europe and how high industrial societies and high population densities in the Netherlands were driving deforestation in places like Norway and Poland. And if you just had a simple model like the one I showed, where you said land use is a function of population and more population in a given place means more deforestation, you'd completely miss that. And to be honest, in the model simulations that I showed you, we actually haven't taken trade directly into account. And so this is a limitation, a problem of the results that I discussed today. And I think it's something that we would need to account for better in the future, at least in those limited cases and places where we know it was important. Fortunately, I think we have some, when trade becomes important, we also start to have records of that trade. At least large-scale trade. Of course, there's exchange of items of precious goods and perhaps bits and seeds or metal or stones or whatever that people like. And this is not what I'm talking about when I talk about, long distance impact on the landscape. But once there starts to be this kind of distal effects, then there also typically tends to be records of those trade volumes, certainly in places like China and Imperial China and Rome. Then we have ideas about that. You mentioned something about the Greenland lead record and how it was interesting to show that you can actually start to see these sort of pre-industrial impacts on the environment. That's just one example. I would just maybe point out or mention that these sort of effects can be seen also even in Antarctica. We just had a paper come out last week showing that we can see soot from human-caused fires in the Southern Hemisphere, in particular in South America and in Australia and Africa, that is blown to the Antarctica, trapped in the Antarctic ice, which we can measure nowadays, that we can more or less unambiguously attribute in the pre-industrial era to human-caused fire. So humans are managing their landscape, and that soot is blowing around, and in fact, perhaps having influence on Southern Hemisphere climate, which is something that we suggest in this recent paper. And the Anthropocene, yeah, the Anthropocene it's a concept which I agree with you. I don't really like it that much. I do think it's kind of useful as a political construct in terms of, as I said, making people think about the influence that we have on the environment. I think that there's still we have a long way to go as humanity and understand in environmental awareness and in understanding just how pervasive and important it goes, well beyond just, a water bottle that you found on the ground, that some, littering or something like that. But it goes into ecosystems, it goes into climate, it goes into biodiversity, and so on and so on. Yeah, thanks very much for your comments.
Thank you. I was just about to ask you whether you've ever used those studies, samples from ice cores from Antarctica and the Arctic, and I'm glad that you mentioned it just now.
Sure, and if anyone is interested, I can send some links to some of my recent papers where we've been working on that particular topic. Yes.
Well, thank you both for your very excellent conversation. We really learned a lot. So now let's turn to select some questions from our audience. The first one comes from Richard Markov. You mentioned peat is passing. How significant is draining, digging up of peat box or carbon stores relative to clearance of level forests and then to coal extraction?
Yeah, this is really interesting, and actually it's excellent timing because there's a paper that came out this week that, not by me but by other colleagues, where this exact question was posed: how much carbon was released through the cultivation of peatlands, and the suggestion is, if I just bring it up here on my computer, the suggestion is that cultivation of peatlands, of which about 45% of the sort of clearance of peatlands, so conversion of peatlands into croplands, led to 72 gigatons or 72 petagrams of carbon emissions from land to atmosphere, of which about half happens before 1750. So this is potentially really important. Now, I would say that this is I have some issues with that particular new study that was published, because it doesn't really take into account whether or not people would have a preference for cultivating peatlands before cultivating other landscapes. My feeling is that in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, people would rather cultivate other landscapes before cultivating peatlands. So cultivating peatlands would rather come later in time, with the important exception of wet rice cultivation, where you have wetlands and peatlands that are extensively converted into rice paddy from early on. And so I do think it's important. But just to answer the question very specifically, if we would take these numbers from this recent paper, then it would be on the order of 10 to 20% of the total emissions. So the emissions caused by deforestation, remember, around 350 petagrams. And if we would assume something like 30 to 50 petagrams of carbon coming from cultivation of peatlands, then it could be an additional emissions on, that's 10 to 20% of the total.
Okay, thank you. So the second one comes from Joseph Ingerhardt. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. There has been much speculation that an originally green Sahara would have been desertified by pastoral activity. Is it confirmed by your work?
Sorry. That's another very good question. I would confirmed. I'm not sure. Sorry, wait a second. I'm just going to try. Oh no, I missed my answer. I would say it is still a matter of debate. It is a question which is possible, but I do not believe. Okay, so let me back up for a second. The Green Sahara is a period in the early to middle Holocene when there was relatively more vegetation. It was not green. It was the Sahara. What is the Sahara Desert now was not a forest, but there were more grasses and shrubs, and there is evidence for wetlands and lakes and places where there aren't any today. So it was clearly wetter during that period than at present day. Now, the Green Sahara ended because of natural climate cycles. So the Sahara became a desert. It became green, and it went from being a desert to being a relatively slightly greener to becoming a desert again because of natural cycles in the climate that are driven by changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun. Now, the rate at which that happened and the timing could have been influenced by the presence of pastoralists, particularly around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. There's plenty of evidence that were pastoral people living in that landscape. And we also know that semi-desert landscapes are fragile. And if you overgraze them, as we've seen in the Sahel, for example, then there are possibilities for landscape degradation that goes in the direction of what you might call desertification. However, the ultimate driver of the end of the Green Sahara is definitely a natural climate cycle. Now, it might have happened faster, and it might have happened more in a more uniform way because of human influence, but certainly was not caused by people. That does answer your question.
Okay, thanks. The next question is from Jan Van Zeden. What's the role of extinction of megafauna in your analysis? The disappearance of mammals, for example, must have had a large impact on land cover, and probably humans played a large role in the decline of megafauna worldwide.
Yeah, so this is another one of these sort of perpetual questions that my community and colleagues have been trying to tackle for decades. It's really interesting. In this case, it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem. At the end of the last glacial cycle, landscape is changing very fast because of climate warming. And because of that, we have afforestation of these sort of open or semi-open glacial landscapes, which become less easy for a lot of the megafauna to live in. So the extinction of the megafauna is probably caused by a combination of natural changes, because climate change at the end of the Ice Age, with some additional pressure brought on by predation by humans. All right. The land cover changes that occur at the end of the last Ice Age are not really influenced by the presence or absence of megafauna. they would have had, in my view, they would have happened no matter what. We would have had a development of large, areas of forest in areas that during Ice Age times were tundra, for example. And so I don't think we have, we don't necessarily have, I guess the role is still, I guess to just answer the question specifically, yes, megafauna probably had, and we see nowadays, elephants in Africa can have a large influence on land cover. However, their influence would have been in the context of the large scale global changes at that time. And so it wouldn't necessarily have, what do I want to say? It wouldn't necessarily be the only thing that influenced land cover at the end of the Ice Age. And I don't have time to go into more. I want to take a few more questions, but we can certainly take that afterwards. It's a fascinating question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, more interesting questions coming in. The next one is from Gavin Scott Coates. Many of the simulations you showed finished around 1850. How do the subsequent changes during the industrial age compare with the pre-industrial changes?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two things, of course, that happened during the industrial era, and one is everything happens faster, and the other is everything happens with more magnitude. Now, if we think about certain metrics, then there's no comparison between what happens in the industrial era and what happened before. If we think about greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and we take that right up to the present day, then greenhouse gas emissions through human activity are 3 to 5 times greater than the entire emissions that occurred over the entire period since the beginning of agriculture up to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and also, of course, they happen over over 100th of the time almost, right? So this is happening much, much faster. We also see lots of other metrics, things like extinctions and changes in biodiversity, introduction of exotic species, and so on that where there's no comparison between anything that happened in the pre-industrial world and what's happening today. So these changes are important, but they happen slowly over long periods, and therefore are in many ways not comparable to what has happened during the industrial era or since what we call the Great Acceleration, which starts shortly after, right after World War II, in the middle of the 20th century, and goes and continues to the present.
Okay, thank you. So this question is from James Fisher. Thank you for your talk. There's a lot of research on the relationship between fauna die-off and the broader environment, either through the death of a major predator, say the wolves, and the resulting growth in prey species like the deer, or through the death of large herbivores affecting land cover. But I'm not aware of any work relating this to climate. How would the megafauna die-off of large herbivores and predators circa 20,000 BCE affect land cover? And would it be related to the issue of human-caused land fire, with perhaps fires affecting megafauna population?
Yeah, so this question kind of relates back to the previous question that we had about megafauna extinctions and their influence on land cover. I do think it's important, but I don't think it's as important as, say, the development of agricultural expansion, which happens during the Holocene, or industrialization, or anything else that happens later. The megafauna question is something that is still really interesting and fascinating, especially if we could try to imagine what would the world be like without people nowadays, but with lots of megafauna. And the answer is, it would still probably look like like natural vegetation. We'd still have large areas of forest and grasslands and deserts and so on, but they wouldn't, and in places they might be influenced by large megafauna populations, but not in the same way, and not to the same magnitude that humans have modified their environment, even up to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so in the pre-industrial world.
Thank you so much, Jed. So time's almost out.
We can do one more question, maybe.
Yeah, let's leave the last question to Professor Zhu Chen. Professor Chen, would you like to talk or?
Oh,
yes,
yeah.
yeah.
So, thank you, Jed. I was just bringing up one thing that I know many people would react because reviewing the long history of human development, and in particular the damage to the environment and so on, would make one very much depressed. Then many people will say, gee, so now should we go back to the original state of vegetation on the whole the whole earth, or should we continue with new technological innovations and population growth, this and that, because all of this development will almost unavoidably cause more damage, whether we try to target carbon neutral or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question of our times. Can we develop a sustainable world that can support 10 billion population and not destroy the environment, not make our climate, not pose difficulties for humanity to survive because of very large magnitude or even abrupt climate change? Can we avoid catastrophic sea level rise and so on and so on? Can we preserve biodiversity and water resources and so forth? And I think that it's not feasible to imagine that we would return to the Pleistocene and all become hunter-gatherers again. Yeah, we've got to imagine a future world where humans can survive and meet, well, the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, for example, that describe all of the sort of attributes of a future world that we would like to have, without destroying the planet. And there are a lot of great ideas out there. There are a lot of people working very hard to convince governments and individuals to adopt forms of land and energy use that can ultimately get us on a sustainable pathway, and yeah, carbon neutrality or even carbon reductions in the atmosphere is one very big part of that. And I guess perhaps to leave this presentation on an optimistic note, I personally feel like we can do it. Humanity has a technology, it has the know-how to reduce or even eliminate carbon emissions, and it's a matter of collective will in order to be able to make it happen. But I feel like the tide is turning, and even in my own career, I have really seen very big changes in our realization that things, first of all, need to change. Climate is changing very fast. This is going to be harder and harder for humanity to cope with. But at the same time, there is increasing ability to cope with it. And so I think that we in the future, we are for sure living in the Anthropocene. We're living in a time when humans are in the driver's seat. We control what happens on the planet, and therefore we need to take somehow collective responsibility for that by reducing our impact and our demand for resources of all different types, in particular those that are non-renewable and damage the climate, like fossil fuels. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jed.
Thank you, Jed, for the very amazing presentation and research, and thank you, Professor Ding, for your discussion. So we will end here, and so for the audience, please remember to join our mailing list in order to receive instant news about the future events. So now you can just sign up to join our mailing list from this shared screen. So thank you guys again. We look forward to seeing you guys in the next event. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, thank you.